Today's agenda, we're going to talk about Dynamics GP landscape today, what that looks like, different environments for GP today. We're going to review the cost of staying with on-prem servers. We're going to look at why you would move to Azure, and also what does a move to Azure look like. We're also going to review the different components of an Azure environment and what are the next steps and things to think about, and tips and tricks also in your move to Azure. We're also going to review existing GP backups in Azure. So what does the landscape for Dynamics GP look like? Most of you are probably running GP on-prem today, or you may have a different hosting provider that is hosting your servers, or you may even be with one of the GP hosting providers. Or you may even be on Azure, but it may not be configured just quite right for your environment. So that's where I'm here to help. So different on-prem environments for GP. So typically you would have a domain controller, could be a physical or a virtual server. The domain controller is, needed for management reporter and SRSS reports. And then you also probably have a server that's hosting GP, management reporter, and SRSS databases. Local workstation installs, or you may have, set up an RDS server or a combination of the two. You may also have a web server and running GP web client, maybe something else you're doing today. So what are the costs of staying on-prem? We have capital expenses. So those are the physical cost of the server itself. We also have licensing costs to think about. So that's your, Windows license or SQL licenses, or other application licenses that you have in place. We also have to think about operating expenses. So that's your IT personnel that are managing the server, or the cost of, monthly patching of the OS that your IT department or managed services team is doing for you. We also have to think about the physical security of your servers. That's the room, air-conditioned room, or, just a physical room that you're locking up with your servers in it. We also have to think about the time it takes to purchase, update, and configure a server. That can be quite costly. We also have to look at other hardware needs to keep your server up and running. So that's switches, UPSs, all those things play into the true cost of a on-prem server. And then we have to look at the depreciation of existing servers. Servers may be able to last 5 years, but the OS there may no longer be supported by Microsoft. So things to think about, that you also continually have to upgrade those servers and the OSs on them. So why would I want to move to Azure? Well, Microsoft guarantees 99.95% uptime. So also you're not affected by local power outages because those servers are running in the cloud. There's less risk associated with Azure than managing on-prem servers. We talked about, physical security with the servers. If it's in Azure cloud, you don't have to worry about those things. Upgrades and patches of the OS can be done in less time and can be automated, is one of the main advantages, so that IT personnel no longer has to necessarily patch your servers or upgrade them. And then it's also flexible. So if I need more resources at certain times of the year, or I need to increase my data storage or increase users, I can do it very quickly with a few clicks of a few buttons. So another things to consider why you'd want to move to Azure is it's cost effective, as you only pay for consumption. Microsoft has made a commitment to support GP until 2028 and beyond, and then it also moved to a modern lifecycle policy, which means yearly updates on a predictable schedule. Usually, October, November timeframe is when those new updates come out for GP for Microsoft. Also, Azure is very scalable, with working from home and remote growth today, an Azure infrastructure makes a lot of sense. It also enables modern platform enablement. That means you're using the latest technology that Microsoft has deployed within the Azure environments. So you don't have old servers or old OSs anymore. It's also a lot more secure with identity management model with Azure AD integrated into it. So what does moving to Azure look like? Well, there's a couple different scenarios to consider here. First one would be a hybrid solution where you keep your existing domain controller on-prem, and then you actually move your SQL Server and then the hosting or access of GP to Azure. You may need to set up a virtual gateway to put on your local network and then Azure network on the same network, meaning you've basically created a network between your local on-prem server that's hosting the domain controller and the Azure servers that are in the cloud. When you then move to SRSS or MR, for example, you will have to use an existing on-prem domain user to authenticate. So it's using, if I'm logged in as domain1/Paul, I'm then on my local domain, but in Azure, it's on that same network, so I'm able to authenticate to SRSS or MR. It's also good to set up a secondary domain controller VM in Azure as a backup in cases where something happens to your existing on-prem domain. Scenario 2, in moving to Azure would be I move everything to Azure. So I'm moving. What this looks like is a user would log in into their workstation using their M365 account. They use Azure Active Directory domain services to facilitate the domain requirements of MR and SRSS. I then have a virtual machine for SQL, and I use Azure Virtual Desktop Services for users to access GP and other applications. And I'll show you this in a bit. So what are the different components of Azure? Well, I'll start off with I have a virtual machines or VMs. These are really servers in the cloud. Each virtual machine has a different RAM or CPU configuration. So I can choose, as I talked about before, if I need to upscale or I need more RAM, I can definitely increase that or bring that down to a lesser machine that costs less. You also mostly pay for compute hours associated with virtual machines. So that means if the VM is not on, you don't pay for this resource. So most people will keep their machines on 24 hours a day, but you do have the option to turn it on and turn it off and not consume those hours when not using them. And then each VM, as I indicated, can be scaled up or down as needed. With GP, our SQL Server would be a VM that we need to configure. Another storage of Azure is Azure Storage. It's basically a hard drive in the cloud, but far better. It's used for drives within those virtual machines. It's durable and highly available. Data is replicated in a way that makes it highly available in the event of an outage. Secure. All data is written to Azure Storage. Account is encrypted by the service. It's scalable, can be grouped to meet your needs. It's also managed. Azure handles all the hardware maintenance, updates, critical issues for you. Some of the different things within those Azure storage are Azure Blobs, Azure Files, Azure Disks are just some of the services around Azure Storage that we can consume. It also has the ability to have the hot, cold, and archive storage with different costs for each a layer. What that means is, hot means I'm accessing the data continuously. Cold is I may be almost never accessing that data. And then there's archive storage, which is things like backups, which I almost would never need to archive. So depending on when accessing that data determines the cost. Once again, Azure storage is fairly inexpensive. Another component is Azure Virtual Desktop. So what is this? Well, this is a service used to access our apps. So GP, Management Reporter, SRSS, etc. It allows for a full desktop, or I can access as a remote app. It runs Windows 10 or 11 and can be multi-session to reduce costs. That means having multiple people logged into that same Windows 11 machine. It also has VM sizing and scaling policies. So depending, person one logs into one of the Azure Virtual Desktop machines, person two gets redirected to machine number two. So this is load balancing policies in place. It allows for images, app, and profile management. So, I can have a user that would have certain apps visible to them and other users that would have other apps available to them. This also allows for remote app streaming, low latency, high performance user experience from virtually any device. So I can be at home, on a tablet device, I can use Azure Virtual Desktop. And then it uses remote desktop app to sign in. Another component is Azure Domain Services. So think of this as your Azure Domain Controller, but in the cloud running as a service. It's a service that allows for domain join, group policy, and lightweight LDAP or Kerberos NTLM authentication. You can use it without needing to deploy, manage, or patch domain controllers in the cloud. It integrates with your existing AD tenant. It's highly available, including multiple domain controllers that you don't have to manage. If a scenario, in our scenario 2, where everything is moved to Azure, then this will be required to manage authentication to MR, SRSS, and etc. Other components of Azure are Azure VM backups and Azure Backup Center. This is used to back up your VMs, your storage disks. You can create a vault to store your backup into. Things like retention policy, redundancy, alter costs. So being locally redundant will be far less expensive than if I was to geo-replicate my data into multiple data centers across the world. And then moving data to archive tier is also less costly. For example, archive tier is, 0.0036 of a cent per gigabyte, or 36 cents per 100 gigabytes. And then we also use Azure Backup Center to manage our backup processes. Some tips and tricks when thinking about moving to Azure are, if you're planning on leaving your machines on, most of you will, you would look at potentially locking those into 1 or 3 year reserved instances. By doing this, you can save up to 72% discount on the VM costs themselves when you're going with the reserved instances. One of the tricks is, or one of the things you want to probably do is start off with pay-as-you-go plan for the first couple months, make sure everything's running the way you want and you have the proper resources allocated and all those types of things before you lock in to a specific reserved instance. Other thing to think about is printers and other applications. So you want to think about printers and the speed which things print. So because you're in the cloud, you send a print job from one Azure service and you're sending it down to a local printer that's beside your computer, it's going to take longer than if you're on-prem. So some of the ways you can mitigate this would be set up a virtual gateway to put that printer and the Azure virtual machines on the same network, and then printing is nice and quick. You also want to think about other applications that you may be running on your existing SQL box or GP environments that are on-prem today. Things that could be moved to Azure Remote Desktop Services as an app and accessible just like GP would be. So things to think about are OneDrive and, like I said, other applications. So what does this look like today? Here's a screenshot of me launching a remote desktop application. And then I have a button that says subscribe. I then would click on that and log in with my M365 account. And then this is, my remote desktop workspace running with my apps. So as you can see, I have GP, I have a Edge browser, I have Management Reporter, and then I have a icon for the full desktop session. So um, most of you will choose one of the two options. So it'll either be, the full desktop, it'll be individual apps. So once you have launched GP, it's going to show up in my taskbar as another um, icon with the two little arrows pointed at each other. So pretty seamless to the end user. So what are some of the next steps you want to think about? Um, so you want to, work with your GP partner, which hopefully is Stoneridge. Um, we will send out a questionnaire and do a discovery of your existing environment. We will then gather information as to what you're running GP on and ISV products you're using. So that entails, current server specs, number of companies you may have, disk space consumed by databases. We'll review the number of users. We'll look at your workloads, what you're actually running. We'll look at the modules and functionality you're using in GP. Then we also want to review the integrations you may be running and moving what's required to move those to Azure. If they're connected to other applications or on-prem products, those are all factors into moving to Azure. And then we also want to review what other apps you're running on your servers as well. So something else we want to look at is what you can do today. So moving GP backups to Azure. So most of you are running backups where you're just, running a backup using Veeam or products similar to that, where you are, or even maybe you're just, putting them onto disks and somebody's taking those drives home every day. So these are all things that can be replaced with backups to Azure. So even if you have on-prem SQL today, we can set up the backups going to Azure offsite in the cloud to an Azure storage account. You also want to look at having proper setup maintenance plan in place. And then you also want to look at backups to Azure storage. And those could be full backups once per day or a log backup, and then differential backups that happen throughout the day. So most of you are probably on a once per day full backup. So from a high level, what are the other components of Azure backup? So we have Azure Blob storage components. So we have to create a storage account in Azure, and then we have to create a container within that storage account. And then we have to have a storage blob within the container. So usually the format's going to be, my storage account .blob.core windows.net, and then the container and the blob. And I'll walk through this in a little bit. And then the other component is my SQL Server component. So I need to, have a credential stored within my SQL Server, SQL Server Management Studio account, and to facilitate this. So first step is walking through this would be we need to create a storage account. So here's a screenshot of a storage account that I've created. So I just go to the Azure portal and basically create a storage account. So that'd be step one of the process. Next thing I need to do is create a container within that storage account. So I still have my storage account, and then I have my container called demo that I created here. And the next step is within that container, I have to set up access policies and set up a shared access tokens. So I would just click on access policy and then click on the generate SaaS token and URL, and it'll give me my blob SaaS token and SaaS URL. And then the next step is within SQL Management Studio, I'm going in there and setting up credentials to connect to that Azure storage account. So I'm creating a new credential and then putting the storage account and container and the credential name on the on-prem server, identifying identity should be a shared access signature. And then the password would be everything after the question mark that I've highlighted in yellow here. So, and that's not the full password, but yeah, that would be similar to what the password is from that previous screen with the shared key. Once I've done that, the next step is I am changing the backup process from or backup to be a URL and then putting in selecting the ad and then selecting my Azure storage account container URL, which I've highlighted in yellow here to be put in here. So then after my backup was to run, I would have a .bak file stored within my Azure storage account, as you can see here. So call to action. So what are the things you want to start doing? You want to start looking at the true costs of those on-prem servers and how it compares to um, Azure accounts. You also want to engage Stoneridge to perform an on-site discovery and questionnaire. And then you also want to get an inventory of what you're running on your current servers, be that GP or other applications. You want to make sure you've identified all those other apps that you may want to move to Azure as well. And then you may want to look at some of those workloads that you want to move to Azure today. So we talked about, Azure backups. That's a good way to get started using the Azure services or just moving some of those other workloads to Azure.